بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. For tonight's lecture and tomorrow's lecture, I wanted to introduce very simple concepts that are involved in the science of Hadith. I've tried to simplify it and make it as exciting as possible because by nature it is quite a boring subject. Pardon? Very
Dry.
Yes, I can't hear you. Yes.
Very dry subject, I mean.
Oh, very dry subject. Yes, you're right. Yes. Thank you for confirming it. And but the reason I'm touching upon this is because in this community and other communities, certain sound bites have been given, and sometimes certain half-truths have been given. The sound bite has to be rebutted and refuted, but the half-truth has to be completed a bit. When you're given a half-truth, you don't have the whole story, you may make the wrong judgment. With sound bites, you shouldn't even be listening in the first place. There's something wrong. You're in the wrong audience. The sound bite which really disappointed me, and I felt very sorry for the scholar who has been attacked, and the scholar is Allama Majlisi, the compiler of Biharul Anwar. Some students have said that, and maybe some speakers or scholars, I don't know, but more than one person, that more than 90% of Biharul Anwar is superstition, khurafat. That's a definite, that's a falsehood, and inshallah I'll explain why. And then sometimes the half-truth is a very notable scholar, again, they're more learned than me. They come and say that in the Al-Kafi collection of ahadith, X%, more than 50, let's say 80% are not sound. And see, that also is very misleading. And the way they are analyzing Al-Kafi is in the same way that one analyzes the Quran, when you shouldn't do that. If you want to compare the Quran, you don't do it with Al-Kafi. You can do it with all the ahadith. But anyway, the statement is semi-misleading, albeit true. Yes. Or semi-truth at least. So, we're going right from the beginning. Imagine this is now a classroom. And please feel free to ask any questions as we go. At least for once in our lives, a very quick introduction from the very beginning. So, I'm assuming that someone is sitting here who hasn't studied the science of Hadith at all. I really tried to simplify things. Okay, so let's start. One or two basic definitions to start off with. So sunnah, when we say sunnah, and the translation, I've chosen the word tradition. So sunnah or tradition, it can be a saying, it can be an action, a saying coming from the Prophet or the Imams, an action coming from the Prophet or Imams, or sometimes a tacit approval coming from the Prophet or Imams. A tacit approval is a silent go-ahead, green light is given. Certain, for example, before Islam, certain transactions were happening, Islam came, the transactions were continuing, and in this particular transaction, the Prophet, the Imam, they said nothing. So saying nothing is a tacit approval that this transaction, for example, is okay to continue. Sometimes they would say something and adjust. Yes, they would adjust the transaction, for example. And there are many examples in fiqh. Now, when a transmitter reports, yes, I feel that there is an echo going around my ears, yes. So, when a transmitter reports the sunnah to others, sunnah is the tradition. Now, someone is reporting it, this someone, will explain who are they in a minute. They're reporting it, the sunnah, to others. Now, that which is reported, the sunnah which is reported, it's called a narration or a hadith. The action itself was sunnah or tradition. Now, when this is being reported by transmitters to others, now that reporting, we call that a narration or a hadith. So this is what we're going to analyze the mechanisms of. So the hadith is the reporting of a sunnah. Okay, so far so good? Yes. Yes. Although if you want to write it down, it's okay, but these slides are yours, brothers. There's no problem. It's all your property. Al-Falah's property is. So a hadith is the reporting of a sunnah. Okay. Next slide. Now, as a result of mentor-student relationships and the passing down and relating of ahadith, sequences of chains of transmissions have resulted. Look, let's go back here. The tradition was the saying of the Prophet, or the action of the Prophet, or the Imams. I'm using them both together. So who would transmit or report the actions and the sayings? The closest disciples, students, then the students of the students, sometimes maybe friends, family, wives. So, but those who were in contact with him. And then they would be learned people, many of them, and they would go and report it to their students or the next generation. So this is very natural for this to happen like this. There's nothing strange about it. And many of the Imams, especially Imam Baqir, Imam Sadiq and Imam Kadhim, alayhimus salam, they would emphasize on write it down now. And then they would write it down. And they wouldn't add anything, subtract anything or classify anything. But they would write it down then. And I'm not saying they would write the exact wording. Sometimes they would use their own wording. But the message, the main message, as they understood it, they would record. Now, here, so this would keep on happening. So you would now get a chain of transmitters. Starts from the Prophet and the Imams. But then the next in line, the next in line, the next in line, you get those, we call them chains of transmission. During the verse of the Quran, we say verses of revelation. In relation to verse of the Quran, we use the word nuzul, revelation. For hadith, we use the word, the Arabic is sudur, transmission. Although it doesn't have the same sanctity, of course, but still. Here, these, when it from the Prophet to one person, then that person to another person, and at the same time the Prophet may have many people around him, and he's telling a group of people, then that group of people, they all go out and give a group of people what they've been told. So chains start to develop. And then it was only in the 3rd and 4th century. Now, minor occultation ended 329 AD. But since then, from the beginning, it's almost 300 years now. It was only in the 3rd and 4th century that some people, scholars of the day, kind of classified and organized all these different transmissions that have accumulated. They said, let's give this some order. They have a very important role in the science of Hadith. We're all kind of indebted to them. You know, if you just think about, for example, your great-great-great-grandfather. For example, what happened to them in India? And what happened when they made them come to Africa, for example? Then why did a group of them go to the UK, for example? There are many stories they've recalled. Your great-great-grand, they said to their children, then their children comes to theirs. But since they're not holy or sacred people necessarily, what they said is a bit of history, family history. There's no need to make a big thing out of it. But here, these are the words of the Prophet now, the words of the Imams now. Although the Imams and the Prophet, they are called the talking Quran. It's very, very high status they have. Yes. If they were to give you an instruction, that instruction wouldn't be less than a Quranic instruction if the Prophet himself told you. What's happening with the chains of transmission of Hadith, these are reports of sunnah. Remember the definition. Hadith is a report, it's not the actual wording. That is, we don't pretend that it's the actual wording of the Prophet or Imam. They said something and the message was conveyed. Like in history and what your great-great-grandfather would say, it may not be the same words used, but he would convey the message. Anyway, these scholars in the 3rd and 4th century, 2 or 3 of them are very well known. Sheikh Sadur, Sheikh Tusi, and Sheikh Kulaini. But there were many others. They really put it upon themselves for the succeeding generations to know what the preceding generations, what was going on. And they were either in the time of Ismat during the 12th Imam's minor occultation, or their period was stuck. It's stuck to the period of Ismat, following it from that period. So it was connected to it. And so they would compile. And naturally, these scholars had mentors, more than one, who had mentors, who then eventually would get connected to the Prophet or the Imam. So these scholars are very important to validate their authenticity, and also it's very important because they have certain chains which, if those chains were to be invalidated, that would cause a big problem. So they're the missing link, so to speak. And one problem that we have is many books were written by the disciples and the disciples of the Imams. Many books. They've counted them as 400. Most of them we don't have access to today. There were fires, invasions, this, that, and the other. The names are given, but the original books now, we don't have them. For example, Nahjul Balagha, Sayyid Razi, who was the compiler, today, maybe, they've done a lot of research on it, 70 to 80% of all the sayings in Nahjul Balagha, they found the source. They found the chains of transmission. It was a very difficult project because Sayyid Radi didn't mention from where he would take the books, those statements. He was just a compiler, but he had access to the 400. He had access to many of the 400. I say 400 because it's a well-known phrase, the 400 effects. The 4 effects as in products. And so, for example, during Sayyid Razi's time, there was a fire because of certain clashes between denominations, and libraries were burnt. Many of those 400 were lost. But can we assume that Sayyid Radi, since he had access to them, he would choose the authentic traditions when he was compiling Nahjul Balagha? It's a historical point. It's history. The trends have to be, the patterns have to be evaluated. Some people said, of course we can. Even before the ahadith their sources were found, they said, look, Sayyid Radi had all the books under his supervision. He was one of the heads in Baghdad. And there were libraries there. He had all the access. Now, he didn't write the sources, but he had all the access there. We can very easily affirm, and for us it's, confidently we can say, I'm saying a scholar is thinking like this, that Nahjul Balagha then is all correct. Now they've found 70 to 80% of the sources, but even if they didn't, look, they say Sayyid Radi had access to all the books. And there were many other scholars in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Compiling was a big thing that they did. It was a missing link between the preceding and the succeeding generations. So what would happen is this 3rd or 4th century, 3rd century, because Sheikh Kulaini was born in the 3rd century. He died in 329 after Hijrah. So a 3rd or 4th century traditionalist, one who is to do with the sunnah and its transmissions, relates from A. It may be one of their mentors. Sheikh Kulaini had a number. And A relates from B, who relates from C, and from chest to chest, this generation to generation, it was all passed down. And C relates from D, who relates from a disciple of the Imam or the Prophet, who relates from the Imam that the Imam said, and then you get the reporting of the Sunnah. See, it's very straightforward, inshallah, so far. Should be straightforward. So here, I've drawn something like that. So Sheikh Saduq or Sheikh Tusi or Sheikh Kulaini, or he was known as Thiqatul Islam Kulaini, he would narrate it from A, from B, from C, C from D, D from E, from a disciple, from the Imam, then the content of the hadith was given. So that's something important. Have that as a model, although it's a random thing, it's not. So far, 2 things you should have now become curious in relation to. One is the content of the hadith. Okay, that's one. But also, and just as important, is the chain of transmission. These 2 seem to be the pivotal elements to the science of hadith. We have to get to know a bit more about these 2. How reliable are they? That's the main question. How reliable is the content? You have a right to say that. And how reliable are these chains of transmissions? Who was A? Okay, you've given me Sheikh Saduq, Sheikh Tusi, Thiqatul Islam. Even history will prove it. Even if you're not a non-Muslim, that these people were authentic people. They weren't liars. They were true scholars. They endeavored hard. I'll explain 1 or 2 of the circumstances as we progress. But, okay, who was A? Who was B? Who was C? We want to know these 2. What kind of people were they? The chain of transmission is just as important. So how reliable are these two components, the content and the chain of transmission? So it's all about reliability. In the science of hadith, you have to acquire reliable information. So, in relation to the reliability of the hadith's chain of transmission, what you're in effect saying is, has it been transmitted accurately from an infallible? That's your main concern. These transmissions, which is traced back to an infallible, have they been transmitted accurately? There may have been a liar in between the transmitters. Sheikh Saduq, okay, we know he's not a liar. It's substantiated. What about the others? Who were they? How do we know? So that's one. Reliability of the content is in effect you're saying, well, is it accurate? Is the content accurate? You've now given me a hadith and you're reporting it and you're saying it's an imam is saying it. Do you have a right to say how reliable is this content? Do you have that right? Definitely yes. You can't take it at face value, and I'll explain why. There is another reliability which they discuss in the science of hadith. I won't discuss it here in this session. It's a reliability of what they call conflict resolution. You get two sunnahs which go against one another. How are you resolving it? Are you resolving the conflict between two hadith reliably or not? For example, there are two sets of hadith, they're accurate, they're sound, but they go against. Sometimes you may prematurely say it was taqiyya, one of them, when it wasn't taqiyya. There may have been other reasons. So, but I won't be talking about this third component right now. The main focus is how reliable are the chain of transmissions and how reliable is the content. Now, in these two components, chain transmission and content, they have what we call, it's a very important key word, contextual indicators. Now, it may be a wrong translation, you may give me a better one, but the Arabic is qara'in. Contextual indicators. Now, there are contextual, so here we have a hadith, it has a chain of transmission. How reliable is it? We have a hadith, there's a content, how reliable is it? Now, there are contextual indicators which can inhibit or stimulate and enhance the reliability of the chain of transmission or the content. Now, I'll just give one example just in case some of you may have missed that. So, for the content, you say, well, this is on the par with the Quran. Ah, right. The reliability factor goes high in relation to the content of that hadith. Okay? So there's a content that we have. Now there are contextual indicators which can further enhance you reaching reliability and confidence in relation to the content of the hadith or the chain of transmissions, or those contextual indicators may be so strong in the other sense that they may inhibit your reliability and you having any trust in relation to the chain of transmissions or the content. So naturally we would have to see what are those contextual indicators. And this is what the science of hadith is all about. Now, there are many of them, there are different types, and some of them, the strength factor in inhibiting or stimulating that reliability of either of the two components varies. So it's not a universal for all. So we have a holistic approach when we come and face and encounter a hadith. There's a chains of transmission with the contextual indicators. there's the content of the hadith with the contextual indicators, put it all together. The scholar says, am I certain about this hadith now or not? Is it a true transmission? It may lead to uncertainty. When you holistically evaluate all the factors together, it may lead to uncertainty that the hadith, yes, this has been relayed by a ma'soom. It's the scholar's call, the mujtahid's call. It may lead to uncertainty that the hadith is factually correct. It's very easy with the contextual indicators which I'll mention. It may lead to uncertainty that the hadith has been accurately adopted within a conflict scenario. And if the answers to these are yes, then that is hujjah for you. The term hujjiyya in English is probativity, proof. If you've answered yes for these on the whole, then yes, you can now act upon that hadith. You can act upon it. It may be an article of faith, it may be an action, and we'll speak more about that in a minute, but you can act upon it. Unless, for example, it's substantiated that taqiyya was involved in that hadith reporting, or for example, it's substantiated that the wording of the Prophet or Imam, the genuine intent or the lack of genuine intent is substantiated. For example, the Imam said, someone was doing something, he said, cut their tongue. Okay, it doesn't mean the physical tongue or, they didn't intend it in a genuine sense. Yes, okay. So the holistic approach is important to bear in mind. So, sometimes a transmission is reliably proof because you've gone through the chains and the transmitters, everyone's okay. But its content is not accurate. And that's when the Imam wanted to do taqiyya, would say something, and therefore the content is not on a par with a previous saying that he said in relation to a ruling, for example. Or sometimes people and the ghulat, those genuinely ghali people, they would sometimes forge the traditions. And they had some influence within circles and they would forge certain traditions. For example, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam has mentioned that people who have forged ahadith into the books of the disciples of my father, may Allah curse them. So, although all the chains of transmitters were all okay, but the content is forged. So just because, look, listen very carefully, just because the chain of transmissions is all okay, it's not a definite. Okay, it's important, but it's not a definite. Also, sometimes a transmission is not reliable. There were weak entities involved in the chains of transmission, and you conclude that this is not a reliable chain of transmission, but its content is accurate. The content of it, though, you have certainty in relation to. It's a weak hadith, but you act upon it. And here, for example, and I'll explain as we progress, but just to give an idea, now I've mentioned the point. Sometimes, for example, there were certain hadith which the earlier scholars had in the 2nd or 3rd century. It passed down, and let's say there were 100 of a particular hadith, or 50 of a particular hadith. Some of them were all accurate, some of them were weak. They were a mix. Then some books got lost. Now the earlier scholars had access to the earlier books. For them it was a definite. The contextual indications for the earlier scholars was that yes, this is something legitimate, the Imam Ma'soom has said it. We had access to the original. But now the books have become lost. The books that we have saying the same material, the chains of transmission are weak. Those scholars still act upon those weak traditions. Why? Because they had access to contextual indicators. So you see, a number of scholars, which was in connection to the time of ismat, of infallibility of the imams, they, even though the ahadith are weak, you see them one after the other accepting them and basing their fatwas on those weak hadith. This shows that those scholars had access to something which later generations did not have. This happens. So they say that the acting by, abiding by of the scholars of that generation compensates for the weakness of the hadith. Now, 90% of the maraji today accept this. One or two don't. And the important one was Ayatollah Khui, rahmatullah alayh. For example, he said, no, for me it won't compensate. It's a very legitimate opinion. Whether who is right, but the minority and the majority, it's very clear. More than 90% are like this, who say, no, when the scholars connected to the time of, they're giving these fatwas and they're acting upon it, even though the hadith is weak, they had access to these contextual indicators, which we don't. But the very fact that they're acting by it, it shows that this hadith comes from an imam. Ayatollah Khui said, no, they had access to the contextual indicators. I don't have that access. For me, it's my own story. It's a minority position. You know, Ayatollah Khui was a very strong scholar, a very strong mujtahid. And sometimes I feel sorry for him because he's criticized a lot. Not criticized in a negative sense, academic criticism and refuting. And the reason why he is criticized a lot, and they always attack some of his theories, is because alhamdulillah, he wrote a lot. He wrote a lot. When a mujtahid writes a lot, the susceptibility factor, making them susceptible to attacks and criticisms, is more and more, and that's only natural. Rather than a mujtahid who may be a marja, but they've written very few things. And that's not going to help too much for the cause of knowledge. But Ayatollah Khui was really an incredible figure. What his services for Najaf, keeping Najaf alive, especially in the time of Saddam. And there are many stories that have been related, very incredible stories. But so at least have this in mind, that when one or two maraji give this opinion, there are many, the majority don't. You can't just stick yourself to this one marja and then come up with a conclusion and say, Islam says this. No, you have to at least evaluate it. For Ayatollah Khui, it was like that. Now, when you want to explain the science of hadith, you can't just give one position. You have to explain them all. So, we now want to go through these contextual indicators. There are 44 of them in books of, old, and it's a very, as the brother said, it's a very dry subject. I don't want to confess how many months I only studied this science, and it was a very long time ago, and I never looked back. After all these years, who would have thought that the community is facing a dilemma? It's threatening certain people's perceptions of great figures like Allama Majlisi, and now here I am here. So here, let's look at the contextual indicators which are transmission related, contextual indicators of the chains of transmission, and then the contextual indicators of the content of the hadith. Now, I'm not going to go through all 44. I've chosen 6 of them. These are the more common of the 44. Now remember A to B to C to D to E to disciple to the Imam? That's a chain of hadith. Now let's look at the contextual indicators. The most important, and this everyone says, contextual indicator for the chains of transmissions is that of the transmitter's reliability. That's the most important indicator. So the chains of transmissions has many contextual indicators. This is the most important. With Ayatollah Khoury, again, a minority position, this is the only contextual indicator. And whatever remains are very few in number. Most of the other contextual indicators we're going to mention, he says, no, this is the most important. And then the exceptions he has, he'll mention where. But this is the most important. Is the transmitter a reliable source? Now, reliability depends on many things. And as a result of these many things, the degree of reliability can be something from very strong to very low. For example, were they known or substantiated to be just? Were they of the 12 Imami doctrine? Even if they weren't substantiated to be just means they don't sin, in public. Were they of commendable disposition? Or maybe they were from non-Imami denominations like Sunnis, but they were trustworthy. For example, a term you may hear as we progress, or you may have heard, are the Waqifites, or the Waqifi sect, who believe that Imam Kadhim didn't die, for example. And he's like how we see the 12th Imam, they sit with it. Now, someone may, until that period where Imam Kadhim alayhi salam died, people would go to Imam Rida. They won't, the Waqifis won't. They don't accept Imam Rida, for example. Now, maybe that scholar or person, before the death of Imam Kadhim, he related a number of hadith. Everything was normal then. Everything was okay. They related many hadith that we have. Then Imam Sadiq passes away, Imam Kadhim passes away. Then, since they were powers of attorney of the Imam, their wakil, they had a lot of the khums money, for example. They wouldn't give it to Imam Rida alayhi salam, because they said Imam Kadhim is still the Imam. He's in occultation. So they're usurping their money. You see? Now, here, many scholars, say they are not a reliable source. You can't bring them. If a chain of transmission has them, we reject it. Ayatollah Khoury, though, doesn't. There are many Waqifis who, he says, they're Waqifis, they ended up with Waqifis. But they were reliable people at the time. Look how difficult it is to, analyze. But how exact and precise he is. You can't just because someone ended up as a Waqifi, because, one person, if they're weak, the whole chain of transmission is, now questioned, is criticized very heavily. It requires a lot of compensating to get it back on track again. So you see, so Ayatollah Khoury also has these opinions. The Sheikh Saduq example I gave, Sheikh Saduq, Sheikh Kolaini, yes. Ayatollah Khoury had this opinion. And many of those who were his followers were disappointed why he gave this opinion. There's a book called Kamil al-Ziyarat. It's by Ibn Qulaway. It's translated into English too. Ibn Qulaway was from the 3rd, 4th century. Look what Ayatollah Khoury saw in this man on analyzing him. He said, whoever's transmitter name that Ibn Qulaway has brought in his book of Hadith, Kamil al-Ziyarat, that transmitter is reliable. whoever is named in the book. Why? Because Ibn Qulaway said, I have only relayed from reliable transmitters. Even if the names of those, and many of them aren't in the books of the scholars of biographies of these people, like Najashi or Kashi. These are also earlier scholars, and they have books of biographies of all these people who are in the chains of transmissions. Even if, and that's important, that the Sheikh Tusi, Najashi, Kashi, they have books of biography. Here you have to always see what they say about these people in the chains of transmissions. But here suddenly you see Ayatul Ukhuwi, someone who's super precise, super precautionary, contextual indicators, only this one. They says, whatever transmitter you see the name of, which is in this book of Ibn Qulaway's, it's accepted by me. He also says the same in relation to Ali ibn Ibrahim. With these two, many people, they were bewildered with this. But now I can't go through why he said it in relation to those two. It requires a bit of expertise. I may not be able to convey it in the best way. But look at the, precision here. And so, when you say Ayatul Ukhuwi, you have to look at the whole picture. You could just take a bit of him and a bit of this scholar, a bit of this scholar, a bit of this scholar, and now invent your own, kind of system of identifying the ahadith. No, it's not a game. There have to be principles here one has to abide by. So depending on these different points, and yes, and sometimes the person is known as a liar, okay. So when a person is known as a liar, well, the chain of transmissions has one liar, then that's a no-go area. We call it a weak hadith. If the chain of transmissions, if everyone in that chain of transmission is a 12 imami and is known to be just, you can imagine that is the ultimate hadith. And we call that sahih. Now, between the sahih, and this is the modern, this is something which came about, the earlier scholars didn't have this classification. They had another type. And the reason they had another type of classification, because they had more access to more contextual indicators, it was more easy for them. But as these contextual indicators withered, the more later scholars, they brought their own classifications. So here, a sound sahih hadith is where the complete chain, A to B to C to the imam, it's complete. First of all, there's no missing link. We know who all of them, who they are, and there are 12 imami, and they're just. It's a very strong, set of criteria there. But a second group is decent, Hasan, decent ahadith, okay, where one or more, they're all, we know the chain is complete, but one or more of the transmitters, they're 12 imami, but the justice factor isn't substantiated. They may have sinned now and again. But they're commendable people. Me and you would have fitted this in this category, where we've sinned, even in public. But we're 12 imami, we're commendable, dependable people. And so this hadith can be used for extrapolating. It's not as strong as the sahih one, but still it's okay. Yes, if you have a sahih and a decent hadith in contradiction, the sahih one will outweigh that. But let's say you only have decent ahadith, hasan ahadith, that's enough for fiqhi extrapolations and maybe doctrinal extrapolations. I'll explain what I mean by that later. Then you have the next in strength, muwaththaq, which is reliable ones, meaning one or more of the chain, they're non-12 imami, okay? But they're trusted people. For example, at your workplace, you may, not only other denominations, sometimes there may be a Hindu at your work. You may even see he's more trusted than the Muslim. It's possible. This Hindu one doesn't lie, for example, or this, whatever this Hindu says is always, he's trusted. But sometimes these are lacked. Either the chain of transmission is incomplete, or one of the people there, they're just a blatant liar, or forgery happened, or whatever. Okay, so here there are these different sets of hadith. Now I ask you, and I put it to you, if someone comes and says, I'm going to go through all the ahadith of one book of collection of hadith by the name of Al-Kafi, and all that interests me is the first group, the sound ahadith. So I'm going to go and see Khulaini's collection of hadith. I'm going to go through all the 16,000, for example, in Usul al-Kafi, or there's more than that rather, maybe 32,000, 16 years. And now if someone says, I'm going to go through all of them, only those where the chain was complete and all the transmitters were 12 Imami and the justice was substantiated, and I get that from the books of biographies by Najashi, by Kashi, 3rd, 4th, 5th century scholars. Sheikh Tusi has one, Al-Udda. Only if these two are met, I will then separate it and say, this is Al-Kafi, a new edition. Is that a good thing to do? Is that a fair thing to do? And if not, why? Okay, and I'll be answering this one question. This whole session is to answer this one question. If it's not fair, why isn't it? But we also give the benefit of the doubt of those not very well-known scholars who have decided to do this. They're not very well-known. Ayatollah Behboudi isn't a major figure. He was a scholar. Yes, compared to me, he was a big scholar. But compared to the elite in Qom, no, he was very average. He was one of the people who, he said, let's get this Al-Kafi, and I'm going to take out only the Sahih traditions. I have nothing to do with the decent or reliable ones either, the Muwaththaq and the Hasan ones. So, most of Al-Kafi may have gone away. And you've left now with a number of ahadith. Now, did Behboudi, who was once, he's done this, did he have a reason behind it? Well, we have to assume yes, it may have been a bit of an exercise. What's wrong with knowing how much are Sahih, how much are Hasan, how much are Muwaththaq? What's wrong with that? It's good to know. But people have got the wrong end of the stick. Behboudi never wanted to say you can only extrapolate your religion from the Sahih ones. He did it with a purpose he had. But you've ignored a whole bunch of ahadith. You've limited Al-Kafi to the sound traditions, and now you want to extrapolate. It's going to be a very limited Islam. Khulaini said, all my ahadith are Sahih. Okay? But when Behboudi looked at it with his own criteria, they weren't, because sometimes the chains of transmissions were missing. Sometimes maybe there was a weak entity in the chains of transmissions. So what was Sheikh Khulaini talking about? Sheikh Khulaini was in the period of Ismat. He was in contact with the deputies. When he says it's all Sahih, it means he has access to a lot of other contextual indicators which Behboudi no longer has access to. And even though there may be a weak source in the chains of transmissions, he's telling you this hadith there is Sahih. Even sometimes the break, the chain of transmissions is incomplete. He's saying this is Sahih. Khulaini was someone who was living around, there were a lot of Sunnis. They would argue with him about his ahadith. He would prove his point. It was a compendium of Shiism, what he had compiled. Many of the students said, look, what are we going to do? Just, can you prepare for us a Sahih collection? He said, I'll do it. Now, I'm not saying he succeeded 100%, but Ayatollah Jawadi Omri says, when you study the life of Sheikh Khulaini, in the environment he was in, he had access to contextual indicators, which later scholars didn't have. So when he says the majority of Sahih, he had access to certain things. Take it. Ayatollah Khoi says, no, I'm not satisfied. I need to know who were the transmitters. I can't just base it on Sheikh Khulaini's word. Those that he's brought everything, no problem. Now when someone like Behboudi, who I'll speak more about, and the criticisms which his approach has, is that, let's say, this is the problem, when you look at Al-Kafi and evaluate it like you would evaluate the Quran. When you look at Al-Kafi, you've taken, let's say, 80% of the hadith away, 20% remain, you say these are the Sahih hadith. Hasan ahadith and Muwathaq ahadith, the weak I won't mention right now, they have been mentioned. Why didn't you look at the other books of ahadith, where those Hasan and Muwathaq ahadith have been relayed by collectors and compilers of other books of ahadith, where their chains of transmission is sahih and the content is exactly as the content which you've just put aside? Now, isn't this doing an injustice? Although I'm not saying that was his agenda. Behboudi was a just person. There's no doubt about it. He was a researcher. It was a bit of research he was doing. He never thought one day people would come and abuse what he was doing. Okay, so I'll come to the weak ahadith, I'll come to in a minute. So, yes, let's go. The next point is that, now, this kind of hadith with this kind of chain of transmission can be divided into two. Sometimes it's a solitary hadith. There's only one of its type, only one hadith. Yes, there are A, B, C, D, E, disciple. That means six. There are six transmitters. But it's one hadith, and we don't have any other hadith like it, for example. I mean, usually we do, but where we don't, it's one hadith, it's a solitary hadith. One chain from A to the Imam. Sometimes no. We have many, which I haven't written the term for that. This is mustafid hadith, there's more than one. But sometimes it's mutawatir, where there are so many chains and transmitters, so many, and I've drawn a picture here, you see, from A to E to the Imam, from F to J, where F to J is different from A to E. There's no commonality either. If let's say A to B to C to D to E, and the second was F to G to H to B to I, there was one which is common to the two, then that would be seen as one hadith. It's not two hadith. There have to be different transmitters. Or from K, L, M, N, O, different disciple to the Imam. When there's a number, a lot of them, so much so that you say, oh, this is definitely a hadith, it definitely exists. It leads to your certainty. Now let's go back to the solitary one, which is only one hadith. Let's say it is of the Sahih type, okay, from A to B to the Imam, it's of the Sahih type. It may be Hasan, it may be Muwathaq, but let's say it's of the Sahih type, okay? This solitary hadith can be further divided into two. It can be unaccompanied, or it is accompanied. Okay, accompanied or unaccompanied with what? It's either accompanied with contextual indicators, or it has no contextual indicators accompanying it. Let's go with the unaccompanied. So you have a hadith. It's a sahih hadith. All the transmitters sahih, no problem, complete chain. But it's only one hadith. Is that proof for you? It's sahih. Now, just bear with this. These are important points here. This is another pivotal issue. So one point I have yet to mention, that sometimes a weak hadith can be compensated or not. Is that possible? But then another is this. You only have one hadith and it's a sahih type. Is that enough for you to follow? The answer is depends. Is it one of the behavioral sciences, or is it something which my heart has to accept? He said, what do you mean? Well, look, when you speak of aqa'id, tawheed, nubuwwat, I have to believe. Not because someone just said something, I believe. The heart has to believe in it. When you want to teach me history, the heart has to understand and accept it. Not just one hadith, now I make my own history up. I say, this happened. This happened with Sulaiman alayhi salam. What's your proof? One hadith. What do you mean? You accept it so quickly? Or with tafsir, with aqa'id, with these kind of things, one hadith is not enough for your heart to be certain in relation to it. One hadith is not enough. But what about in fiqh? If they say it's mustahab to do this, it's wajib to do this, it's ethical to do this, even in ethics. If you have one hadith, is that enough? We say yes. Well, I'm listening to the local Hindu who speaks to me. I trust him. There's no reason to say he's lying. And now we've said this is a sahih hadith. So it's come from the Imam. And the Imam is saying it's wajib to do this action. It's ethical to do this action. It's mustahab, of course I'll accept it. Why shouldn't I? Unless I have something, outside proof that this was taqiyya or something else. But when all the transmitters were saying this is a sahih type, the 12 Imami and just, why should I not accept it? Look, I don't have to believe in the action. I just have to know that such an action came from an Imam, then I act upon it. That's important, acting upon it. But with doctrine, with tafsir, with history, you have to believe it. So when you have one hadith, for fiqh, it's okay. For fiqh, for akhlaq, it's all okay. But for aqa'id, no. One hadith cannot build your aqa'id. One hadith can't build your history, your tafsir. It has to be accompanied with other indicators so that that one hadith becomes enhanced, and then it leads to your belief in relation to a doctrinal article of faith. One indicator is aql, your intellect. There's a hadith, it's solitary. It's on tawheed, it's on nubuwwat. It's a solitary hadith, it's sahih. But your aql, when accompanied with this solitary hadith, say, yes, this is right. This I can accept, I'm certain about it. So this dichotomy is important in relation to solitary ahadith of the sound type. In fiqh, in akhlaq, that's sufficient. But if it's in doctrine, tafsir and history and other sciences, no, you need more. Sometimes that more is aql, sometimes it's historical documents. Other historical documents you gather, and then a holistic picture. Now you have, for example, belief in relation to a bit of history. And then the solitary hadith, when it's accompanied with contextual indicators, well, it's going to be a fortiori sufficient for fiqh and ethics, because even the solitary unaccompanied ones were sufficient. But for doctrine, now, if it leads to your certainty, when the contextual indicators like aql accumulate, it leads to your certainty, that would be proof for you. Otherwise it won't. Solitary ahadith, even if they're sound, cannot be proof for you in your aqaid. The heart, it has to accumulate until the heart says, I believe. Now, Behbudi only brought the Sahih ones. I put it to you again. The Hasan ones, he put aside. The Muwaththaq, he put aside. If he had just looked in other books, those Hasan and Muwaththaq could easily be accompanied with other ahadith on the same theme, okay, which they may be stronger. And then he wouldn't have to neglect those Hasan or Muwaththaq ahadith. The same meaning is conveyed elsewhere. Now, you may have a number of Hasan or Muwaththaq ahadith, it may lead to mutawatir, or you have a Sahih hadith from another collection accompanied with this Hasan or Muwaththaq. It builds onto that trust factor again. The same with the weak ones. The same with weak ahadith. Weak ahadith. If the contextual indicators are right, it can lead to certainty in extrapolating fiqh, even aqaid. But it depends what the contextual indicators are. Are there other hadith with the same theme? What does the aql say? Add them together? It's possible, no? So, then here, the mutawatir ahadith, as I explained, these can be divided too, where these are now a lot of ahadith. And so even if the chains are a bit missing, since there's so much, you say, no, this is acceptable. Now, they can be verbal, or they can be in meaning, the mutawatir ones. The verbal ones, we don't have any. We don't have any mutawatir ahadith where the exact wording is used in all those ahadith, except for two. One of my teachers relates from his teacher, who relates from Allama Tabatabai. Allama Tabatabai said, mutawatir in word, where the exact wording is the same, and they're mutawatir, we only have it two. In the hadith of Qadir, Man kuntu mawla, fahada aliyun mawla. And I leave to you two precious weights, thaqalain. But mutawatir in meaning is possible too. The wording is not exactly the same, but yes, I think the electricity is giving a sign, a contextual indicator that maybe I should stop. Let me see if it's a good place to stop. Okay, we'll stop here, and inshallah we'll continue, although we have a lot to continue now. Inshallah, tomorrow. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala tahirin. Pardon? This one? Yes. Which one? Unaccompanied or accompanied? Unaccompanied, right. It's not sufficient for doctrine. Because doctrine, aqaid, tawheed, the first one, for fiqh it's enough. If you have one sahih hadith, you can act upon it. If it's for fiqh or in akhlaq, anything behavioral. Because you know it's sahih, so you have no problem there, and you don't have to believe in the action. You believe in the chain of transmission. They're saying the very fact that you believe it's come from an imam because it's a sahih transmission, well, you act upon it. You don't have to believe in the action. What's important is acting upon it. That's why taqleed is okay in action. But why is taqleed not okay for aqaid? With aqaid, you have to believe. So one solitary hadith is not enough. Yes, well done. I think it's a good point, you. Yes. Okay. وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله.